All right, chapter 29 is nationalism in Asia, and nationalism is a term I mentioned in the last chapter. This patriotic feeling of support for your country and nation, this idea that you are very pro your country and the culture that comes with it. We get to look at this particular chapter and how that impacts a small section of the world. Well, not so small, Asia. And we're looking at it in the time frame of 1914 to 1939. So we're talking about that time period at the beginning of the First World War all the way up to the Second. And it begins with the World War's impact on national trends. It talks specifically about the Asian reaction to the war in Europe because, like America, it's pretty easy for the Asian nations to say, that's not my war, that's your problem over there. And so this is something that will impact them in a different way than it did in America. Your book talks about the British and the French making promises to these Asian populations through their colonies, saying, if you support us with this war, then we're going to give you your freedom, we're going to give you your independence. And that doesn't always happen. Unfortunately, the British and the French reconsider these promises, and the colonial peoples basically had to come back into, well, do we fight or do we just let this go? And many of them decided they wanted to fight for it. Now, the President of the United States, this is Woodrow Wilson, he had put into his plan for peace that these colonies would be released, that they would be given self-determination. The new countries were going to be given self-determination, that if they wanted to be a democratic nation, that they could have that opportunity. And in many regards, he did see that these colonized nations would be given that same opportunity. So European nations began to, as they're pushing back into, well, you know, we really could use the help of these colonies. We want their raw materials. We want their people. We want their land. We want their, you name it. They wanted it. This has particularly happened in Asia and Africa. There were permanent mandates commissions formed. This was formed by the League of Nations to ensure European powers upheld their obligations within these mandated territories, so they weren't taking too much advantage of these countries. For many, the mandate system was more of a spoils of war method, spreading colonization. We see the communists in the Soviet Union, of all, denouncing European and American imperialism and began to spread their influence to China and French Indochina, saying you can be free, you should be free, and this is how, through communism. So we can kind of see how that happens pretty quickly. Your book moves into the desire for a national identity. It often would instigate these anti-imperialistic resistance movements that were calling for independence. People were excited about nationalism because for so long their identity was really more defined by another culture coming in and telling them how to be. Well, you guys are actually barbarians, so we're going to tell you the better way to live. This is the European people. This is the national people. And this was a constant clash, but for so long the native people just accepted what was being told to them. This was a promise. Nationalism was a promise of a better future. The we and they mentality began to develop more tensions between the national people and the Europeans, and it even would turn somewhat violent in the idea we need to destroy the Europeans. When European rule would collapse, you would see conflicts within these cultures, often between ethnic and racial lines, and sometimes religious as well, because now they're a new country that doesn't know how to rule themselves. You don't suddenly become free and you know how to do everything. You don't suddenly know how to be a president or be whatever the case might be. So what happens as a result of that? Well, there is an Arab movement that pushes for nationalism, specifically speaking about a measure of ethnic tolerance of ethnic groups, of minority groups specifically. The Turkish government had slaughtered thousands of Armenian Christians just during the First World War. this was millions, and we still don't really talk about this today because it's just been recently that Turkey has admitted that there was some sort of a massacre. We see Arabs in conflict with the Turks, who would then ally themselves with the British, and they were basically fighting back and forth within the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs were hoping for a unified Arab state after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Didn't quite work out that way. The British and the French entered into a secret pact during the war. It's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was dividing the lands of Lebanon, Syria, and southern Turkey. This doesn't sound like a less imperialistic mode. Also in that, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq. These are countries that are very familiar to us today as far as being concerns of world peace. In this, we see the arrangement running contrary to a lot of the agreements that the British had made with the Arabs. We also see the British hoping that the Balfour Declaration, you need to know that for your test, would appeal to German, Austrian, and American Jews in hopes of getting them to support the British war movement. When the Treaty of Versailles did not provide for Arab nationalism, Arabs met in Damascus in something called the General Syrian Congress to call attentions to their demands for independence. In the meantime, Mustafa Kemal's reputation grew after defending the Dardanelles from the British attack, but when the Ottoman Empire crumbles, he basically is brought down with that. You see a Greek invasion of Turkey inspiring a new level of nationalistic fervor. The Turks defeated the Greeks and then won their independence with the Treaty of Lausanne, and you need to know that for your test as well. Mustafa Kemal rises to power again. He's the leader of the Turkish nation, and he worked towards building a more secular state and a westernization of his nation. This is important because for so long in the Middle East, and we still see it today, religious laws are what are defining what the political laws look like. What he ended up doing, though, as a result of that, is he crushed Armenian and Kurdish ethnic minorities and established a one-party system of government. That's not going to be representative enough. You see same things happening in Persia and Afghanistan. Afghanistan ends up going into a civil war, which the Russians end up involving themselves in at one point. Sometimes that particular war, which we'll get to later on, the Russians are often seen as this was their Vietnam. The British end up choosing to align themselves with one Faisal bin Hussein as the king of Iraq. And with that, he worked closely with the British government to accept British control of Iraqi oil fields. You see, it's going to be a quid pro quo. Who can help us and we'll help them sort of thing. In 1932, Faisal had secured Iraq's independence by agreeing to a long-term military alliance with the British. Egypt's another example of this happening. You also have French controlling Syria. With that, you see a designated Lebanon as ethnic enclave for Maronite Catholic Christians, as well as Muslims and Druze. You see Syria winning independence, but Lebanon remained under control of the French mandate. Palestine, make sure and read this material pretty closely because this really does define our Arab and Jewish tensions that we are still struggling with today. You have Zionism, that push towards a free Jewish state. This really comes into play here. Theodor Herzl, he's not the first to come up with this, but he really is the brainchild behind encouraging Jews worldwide to seek this out. You have the Jewish National Fund to try and help make that happen, to purchase land from absentee Arab landowners. You have immigration restrictions that are causing some major problems with both the Jewish and the Arab populations, and that becomes a problem because there's going to be some Middle Eastern countries that are going to try and limit the number of Jews that can come in. And then you have the establishment of the kibbutz, which is a collective farm whose members who work there, they share in the work and they share in the rewards. So make sure no kibbutz as well. Moving on towards India, you see a few things that will be familiar to you. You have Indian suffering throughout the First World War. This suffering is what really does push them into that more nationalist movement. You have Hindu leaders and Muslim leaders that are fighting against each other, but they come together in the Lucknow Pact to unify their nationalist views against Great Britain. They're completely opposite on so many levels, but they have a common enemy, so they come together and they fight the British. The British responded, basically telling them, we're going to clamp down on you. They did undergo a number of reforms. The rollout Acts basically extended emergency measures to curb the unrest and then root out all the conspirators, but they ended up just infuriating the Indians even worse, and this resulted in some riots. The attendees of a Sikh religious festival were not informed of the law prohibiting public meetings. The law had been passed one day. That very same day, they come together, meeting in a religious festival, and essentially the British send in troops and end up killing more than 400 people and injuring more than 1,000. This massacre, as it's called, added fuel to the nationalistic fervor that the British needed to get out. In this, you see the rise of one Mohandas Gandhi. And Gandhi grew up in a very privileged household, ended up studying in Great Britain, ended up living for some time in South Africa, where he began to represent people in South Africa against brutal discriminatory laws. And it's there that he recognized, wait a minute, this is so much like my home. I need to go home and I need to help them. With that, he developed a weapon, so to speak, for the poor and oppressed called Satyagraha. And this was something that literally translates soul force. It means striving for peace and justice through love, suffering, and conversion of one's oppressor. His thought is essentially we need to peacefully demonstrate and fight these people because there's no way we can have enough weapons or anything that can destroy them physically. We need to break them down through peaceful resistance, which if you haven't caught the relationship yet, this is a lot of where Martin Luther King Jr. gets a lot of his ideas. Gandhi ends up organizing a boycott of British goods, basically to protest the problems that the British are bringing on the Indian people. The boycott did so much more than that. It actually excited the Indian people and it influenced a political revolution within India itself. A call for nonviolence resistance appealed to the Hindu population as they were peaceful people, especially to the lower caste members, as truth be told, they were the ones that would have had to fight anyway. The illiterate masses joined with the educated classes against a common enemy. He transformed the Indian National Congress into a political party that accepted every ethnic group and proved to be willing to work with the Muslim minority. He ends up being imprisoned by the British, and the Indian National Congress splintered into factions without him there to kind of unite them. When he was able to get out and reunite the factions, we see one that does not reunite with them. You see Nehru, N-H-R-U. You'll see that in your text, N-E-H-R-U. He called for independence within a year. And so we see a series of negotiations beginning between the British and Gandhi, who tried to set up a new Government of India Act, increasing Indian parliamentary representation. The issue here is that while they unified, the Hindus and the Muslim unify to be a part of this revolution, their interests are too far gone. The cultural issues are such a problem, and many of the Muslim population are too angry about it. The Muslim League leaders began to call for their own nation, or a Pakistan, which literally means a land of the pure. In the meantime, in China, you see Yuan Shiqi. He was involved in a revolution to overthrow the dynastic system there in China. Had been in use for generations upon generations. He ends up being elected president, and Yuan focused on accumulating power for himself, which essentially spiraled into a dictatorship. A student protest against the Versailles Peace Conference led to the development of a movement against foreign imperialists, particularly Japan. This led to the May 4th movement, which you need to know for your test. It had a Bolshevik influence and was very much so pro-Marxist. Sun Yat-sen came in at this point and he allied his Nationalist Party with the Chinese Communist Party to form a National Liberation Front. He was not communist, he was a nationalist. Some of the key points to this Nationalist Party were nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. He hoped that maybe these efforts would reunite China, I should say. Chiang Kai-shek replaced Sun Yat-sen as the leader of the Nationalist Party after he suddenly died, and they moved the capital to Nanjing. The Nationalists and the Communists were naturally suspicious of each other, and in April of 1927, Chiang Kai-shek with the Nationalists moved against the Communists and forced them into hiding. This, of course, doesn't stay the case for long, but we'll get back to that soon. The New Culture Movement, that's another term you want to know for your test. They attacked the traditional Chinese thought and customs, particularly the Confucian virtues. And if you've got a cumulative book that goes all the way back to prehistory, you can look up Confucianism and learn a little bit more about that. It is something that's very Asian as far as the ideals, very much so beloved. It's not meant to be a religion, and it really does evolve into that for most of the Chinese. Marxism and Leninism began to gain a large following, and this is where we were introduced to Mao Zedong, who saw the Chinese peasants as a great revolutionary potential. And so he's going to basically move them together with the first peasant revolt that's called the Autumn Harvest Uprising. It's not successful, but it became a lesson to Mao as far as how to centralize his power. We also see Japan going through a very similar situation. Their population was on the rise so much, but that's a problem because they're an island with limited space. They also had scarce natural resources. This is something that I mentioned in the last chapter as far as why not take over China, because we can't provide enough for ourselves. We see Zubatsu, which is a term you'd want to know. It's a giant conglomerate firm. It employed large numbers of people and owned numerous interrelated businesses that were a large portion of the Japanese economy. You even hear of Mitsubishi in this particular portion, which you're all familiar with. This resulted in somewhat of a financial oligarchy and a corrupt government. Although Japan was an allied force in the First World War, Japanese ultranationalists hated everything Western. It represented everything they hated, and they rejected democracy, big business, and even Marxist socialism. These ultranationalists pushed for the restoration of imperialist Japan and assassinated moderate leaders. And this is where we see Asia for Asians becoming that rallying cry. As far as Japan versus China, Japan had control over Manchuria in northern China, and they were very concerned about the Chinese inequality as far as what the government was doing. They were unhappy to see the Chinese nationalist movement growing, and so the Japanese officers responded by blowing up the railroad in Manchuria, and they used this as their excuse to occupy Manchuria in full force, the Japanese did. When the League of Nations condemned their aggressions in China, Japan just quit. We're not a part of the League of Nations anymore. We're done. Manchukuo in northeast China became a Japanese puppet state, which sets them up in a perfect seat of power in Asia. Rivalries continued between the nationalists and the communists in China. They could not unify long enough to really deal with the Japanese problem. The nationalists tried to corner and exterminate the communists, but the communists escaped, and they ended up embarking on a 6,000-mile walk that's now called the Long March. About 100,000 began the march, and only about 8,000 or 10,000 survived it. Japanese aggression against the Chinese increased dramatically as the Japanese occupied Nanjing, and Japanese soldiers murdered and raped populations by the thousands. An estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese were murdered, while 20,000 to 80,000 women were raped. Now that seems like a pretty broad spectrum of terms, 20,000 to 80,000. The truth is, most people know women historically do not report rapes as often as they happen, and in this situation it is such a cultural problem for them that they have somehow been inseminated with this terrible, evil Japanese power that they are horrified. Many of these women killed themselves rather than face the humiliation, much less the possibility of pregnancy by a Japanese soldier. In the meantime, you see the French colonizing regions throughout the southeast, which they called the French Indochina. And the French denied liberties to populations of this area and subjected them to an authoritarian control. You see also the Philippines. I've talked about them before as far as their role with the Spanish in the United States. Do make sure you read this material thoroughly. Hopefully this is at least a little bit helpful to you as you get ready to take your quiz. Have a great day.